Wireless LAN Professionals Podcast, episode 148.
Wireless LAN Professionals is a place to educate, inform, encourage, and entertain those involved in wireless LANs. This Wireless LAN Professionals podcast is an audio manifestation of these goals. Our host is a wireless LAN veteran, consultant, designer, and teacher, Keith Parsons. And now, the podcast for wireless LAN professionals by wireless LAN professionals.
Today we have an interview with Keith and Jeremy Ward from Transit Wireless. Transit Wireless is the company that brings seamless cellular service and Wi-Fi connectivity to 5.7 million daily New York City subway riders. As a senior wireless network engineer, Jeremy focuses on the architecture and the optimization of the largest high-density Wi-Fi network in the world. And just as a reminder, as with all our interviews, the views expressed by Jeremy are entirely his own and shall not be construed as the views of Transit Wireless, nor their endorsement thereof. Here's Keith and Jeremy.
Welcome. This is Keith Parsons again with Wireless LAN Professionals Podcast, and today I have Jeremy Ward with me from Transit Wireless. Jeremy, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. How are you, Keith?
Great. You have talked a bit in the past about Wi-Fi and in the New York transit system on other podcasts. A friend of ours, Roel, and Francois on their podcast. On this session today, I thought we could talk about some of the things you're doing in the non-Wi-Fi but still wireless world. You good for that?
I think we can.
So a lot of us come from the route switch side, perhaps, starting back with Microsoft or Novell on the networking side, maybe moving into Cisco and getting the route switch behind us before we got into wireless. And yet there's a whole world out there of wireless that was in paging and walkie-talkies and then cellular. And so a lot of us don't have the background in the cellular side. And you started incorporating some LTE and cellular in your Transit Wireless. So I thought we'd bring you on board and have you, kind of give us, thinking that your audience is Wi-Fi guys, tell us how LTE is.
Definitely. I look at it this way, that one of the most valuable lessons I've learned as a wireless engineer is to kind of know what tool to use and when not to use it. And, my background, I started off in 802.11 as well. And then, but more on the access side of the world, using it for delivering internet services in rural areas. And, we didn't use standards-based 802.11 to do that, but, the chipsets fundamentally were that. And then quickly moved into WiMAX. And then from there, kind of straddled the world of 802.11 and carrier access and what have you together. And LTE is an interesting technology in that it has a lot of abilities to service everything from as communications infrastructure, which is the context I think we're most familiar with, to being able to deliver services for specific verticals and enterprises, which is kind of a new use case that before used to cost, millions and millions of dollars, that now is coming down to earth quite a bit. So fundamentally, LTE is an OFDMA technology. It has a similar spectral efficiency in many ways to 802.11. However, there's a lot of complexity, perceived complexity to it, in that the core elements are something that is part of the standard as well, and not abstracted away like they are with many of the enterprise 802.11 products. So, we've in our organization we have been thoroughly studying LTE, looking at it in a transportation context for mass transit, and looking at it as a backhaul technology to deliver Wi-Fi, specifically looking at it how we could deliver that on trains. And it's in that context that we've actually done the most amount of exploration and testing. But in the future, as things continue to evolve, I'm sure everybody's familiar with the CBRS term, or the term or multi-fiber, which is kind of its cousin, I suppose, in the unlicensed 5 gigahertz band. Predominantly, what we've been focusing on is on the CBRS technology. And that technology is kind of going to be a combination of a carrier use case and an enterprise use case in many organizations, in that, it can provide, quality of service functionalities that are over and above what it is that can be delivered on 802.11, but also, and to do so for special, applications that require that, but also as a means of allowing, better carrier coverage indoors, in an enterprise environment. And, a lot of what I've learned about this and how it fits into the enterprise world is kind of said, hey, well, there's a good, healthy amount of WLAN engineers that are out there that could benefit heavily from being able to participate in that ecosystem and not make it something that is a managed service domain purely of the carriers, but perhaps something that can be, used to kind of expound upon the WLAN professionals, repertoire of tools.
Well, part of the reason that WLAN engineers like it is because the clients are everywhere. What do you see in the CBRS world for the client penetration in your marketplace?
Well, at this point, there really isn't client penetration today, but that's going to change very quickly and very rapidly. Verizon very recently has announced that they are fully behind the CBRS ecosystem as both a professionally managed service for enterprise, as well as a component of their carrier network. And they are telling the market that by the end of 2018, they will have flagship handsets on their network that support this band, which is a unique opportunity, I think, when you have a big company like Verizon doing that. But today, you're not going to have a handset that supports this actually outside of the essential PH1, which is available as an unlocked phone. It's an Android phone, runs a Qualcomm Snapdragon 835 system on chip, but available to support CBRS. So that's kind of the big thing. Folks don't expect to see it right this second, but again, by the end of the year, when the band starts to become available from an FCC perspective, we're going to see it's going to be off to the races.
I think the next Apple iPhone announcement will definitely be telegraphing one way or another how this is going to turn out.
Indeed. We understand that not only Apple, but a few other, large vendors are going to have support for it in their next models. Okay.
One of the other LTEs that we're looking at is LTU in its various formats. In our standard 5 gig range, are you working with LTUs in your transit system as well?
At this point, we look at LTU as a supplement. So the world that we've envisioned with LTE as a backhaul technology for trains consists of places or pockets that have unlicensed LTE, but in an LAA perspective, so license assisted access. So it's going to provide additional downlink capacity only to a CBRS network. And we don't, at least I personally don't view it as a technology that's going to have much traction outside of specific industrial applications, if we're talking about multi-fire or what have you. And that's simply because of the fact that there's never going to be any support or very little support from the handset perspective that's been announced at this point. And, there's a multitude of reasons why for specialized industrial applications, multi-fire is definitely a viable technology. Just as a rule of thumb, LTE in general has a 7 to 9 dB link budget advantage over 802.11. So if you think about that on a cost per square meter or per square foot of coverage, it's a considerable difference. But again, multi-fire, the ecosystem around that is perhaps not as heartily supported, from a vendor perspective as CBRS will. I'm sure there's somebody out there that would like to say differently, but that's what we've observed.
Well, another question for you in the transit system. I'm aging myself here, but more than a couple decades ago, I worked on some projects putting in leaky coax this is like precursors to DAS even, inside of subway tunnels, specifically so the cell companies could carry on top of that. And yet it was bought and paid for by one carrier, and that the other carriers wanted to fight and have access to it. How do you deal with, if I'm in your transit system and I turn on my iPhone and I happen to be an AT&T customer, how does my signal get to me?
Well, in the world that we're in, every carrier participates in the distributed antenna system that we have within the subway system. We are looking at expanding perhaps beyond that, into the tunnels, and it would be a similar approach where, we would perhaps build a radiating cable system that would carry all of the carriers who wish to participate. as opposed to having just one carrier. Our primary business focus is as a neutral host in that regard. So that's something, again, very much on our radar. And, you'd be pleased to know that not very much has changed when it comes to providing that type of access in tunnel environments, at least to a handset, where radiating cable is still somewhat king globally. And that is a kind of a tried and true method. But if you look at it in the sense of a neutral host and what the opportunity to technologies like CBRS can enable is that an operator can try to build a neutral host network in a manner that is able to allow everybody who supports that from the handset perspective, being the carriers, to participate in some type of perhaps even a commercial arrangement. So, if you have customers in your enterprise or even in a transit system, let's say, that are, AT&T, Verizon, Sprint, or T-Mobile, and the latter two perhaps may be combining in the future, that we expect the ability to be able to provide from a technical perspective, some type of offload function on an LTE network. Now, that's not something we're necessarily focusing on. We don't look at CBRS as something to provide that necessarily in a tunnel. And I mean purely in a tunnel in the sense where we wouldn't build a tunnel network to do that. But there is a definite, kind of inertia as one of the major use cases for that. And I'm sure a number of folks in the transit environment are looking at that around the world, specifically in the U.S. where 3.5 is a shared spectrum, and especially as we move towards 5G.
So in your system, is the transit authority itself owning the CBRS separate from the neutral host with the cell companies, or are they going to be riding on the CBRS as well?
That remains to be seen. We haven't really, necessarily gotten deep into those types of conversations. The belief is that as an organization that we're as a neutral host, we're in a natural position to deliver those types of services, and independent of the spectrum. There is enough spectrum there to be able to accommodate multiple users, and LTE's ability to segment that traffic from a public carrier perspective to a private carrier type service is definitely built into the standard with the ability to prioritize. The example I give people often is if you look at how the FirstNet network is supposed to work, where there's a large swath of spectrum in band 14 that AT&T will be operating on for the federal government and providing access to first responders on a priority basis, which preempts all other types of traffic. So, a good example of how that would work is as an organization, or when you go to make a phone call, we'll say a VoLTE call to keep it simple. No matter how busy the cell network is, the LTE network is at the time, it could be middle of rush hour, you're still able to make a call as clear as a bell. And how that works is by preempting other types of traffic. So again, it comes down to just, as a simple example, plain old QoS. LTE's implementation of QoS has 9 layers, or 9 different what they call QCIs, which are QoS class identifiers, that can provide a certain prioritization for mission critical traffic, even over voice traffic, and then data traffic and other things beyond that, video, et cetera.
You just impressed me. How did you go about learning this entirely new technology? Is there like courses, classes, or you just did it on your own?
Yeah, I did it on my own. There's a lot of different resources out there. I've been in this world since 1998, 99, very young. I'm completely self-taught. My focus has always been to learn something and that's applicable to the world that I'm, hoping to operate in or, participate in as a professional. So there are a lot of resources out there in that you can actually learn all that there is from a 3GPP standards perspective about LTE. Simply, through Google, there's LTEuniversity.com, et cetera. There's a lot of different resources out there, and right down to the standards themselves. Unlike 802.11, which, is the domain of IEEE, 3GPP freely publishes their standard for consumption by anybody. And it's a little bit to do with the way that the world is put together in 3GPP versus, IEEE, where, in my view, IEEE, as it relates to 802.11, is very much, driven towards chipset manufacturers, while the 3GPP world is driven towards carriers or operators. And it's a homogenized, ecosystem in which vendors, and from the UE side, being the handset to, the RAN side being the network, to the operators all participate in, in a manner that is less to do about units sold per se and more to do about providing a scalable service.
A new item added to my to-do list now. Thank you.
Definitely.
There's so much to learn, but this is very intriguing information. For just another question about this LTE transition as you're going, is there any Hotspot 2.0 is coming along, and we're finally getting to a point where we're starting to be able to roll that out even in enterprises. Are you looking at offering that same type of service that would branch from a wireless connection to a CBRS, and all using Verizon or AT&T as the back end with SIM off or something? Is that in your time horizon?
Potentially. We have the technical capabilities right now, but I think that it's very much a carrier-driven decision. But Hotspot 2.0 doesn't have to be necessarily only an offload technology for carriers, although from a monetization perspective, that's definitely the most clear business case. In our world, we could see Hotspot 2.0 with ETLS or TTLS authentication being a means of providing public Wi-Fi access in a manner that is, encrypts the connection to kind of as a way of dealing with some security concerns folks have with public Wi-Fi. There's also commercial applications. There's also roaming applications to accommodate major cable companies, subscribers, et cetera. But I don't necessarily, it's just too early to say what that's going to look like from the carrier's perspective. But the ecosystem and the standards within Passport.
I like the idea of still having an open, fast, free, frictionless Wi-Fi access for the public. And that Hotspot 2.0 adding the extra encryption is a nice feature. But there still has to be some offloaded authentication. And that's kind of the bugaboo where we're at right now.
Certainly. And I think that provided the carriers are willing, so let's say we talk about eSIM or ePAKA authentication for Hotspot, if that's something that the carriers are willing to participate in as just a means of authentication, that would be a very exciting world because, again, we remove that extra component, that extra bit of baggage that a user has to go through to be able to get on board. But where there is typically that kind of baggage, there is typically monetization involved as well. So again, we're in a transitionary phase. I think that relative to a public access model, how does that look? But the interesting thing is the inner pieces of Hotspot 2.0 are really very much part of the multi-FHIR and CBRS ecosystems when it comes to accommodating devices that do not have a SIM. So, looking at in a certificate-based authentication, for instance, so that's only going to cause the ecosystem to be much more attainable, I think, and far more solutions to be out there. I think the challenge, and maybe this is wrong, but I think the hardest thing if you're as a public operator, even enterprise, is trying to find some sort of do-it-yourself Hotspot 2.0 authentication, and there isn't really an open source, route to go there. There's some, paid services and what have you, but it's as you said, it's only getting to the point now after a number of years where the enterprise can get into it.
Yeah, I was actually quite impressed at Aruba's Atmosphere conference. They offered a Hotspot 2.0, and actually automatically people logged right in. They'd linked into Boingo to do the back-end authentication, but showed that from the enterprise side, it is possible to link into it. So
Certainly.
It was a good little shot across the bow going, hey, this could actually work.
Oh, certainly could. The challenge, I think, comes down to managing handovers. I'm not sure if it's going to be an AC, but maybe an AX, where we're going to see a considerable difference in where Hotspot 2.0's value proposition to a cellular operator really comes to fruition, simply because of the handover concern and the speediness of that and the reliability of that.
You are studying for this new LTE world. Do you think it's going to help you when it comes to understanding how 802.11ax actually operates?
I wondered that question, and I unfortunately, having only so many hours in the day, have been focusing on the 3GPP side, on the LTE side, and other than topically aware of some of the OFDMA capabilities that are built into the AX standard, I have not delved deeply into it as I would like to. But I would say, from what I understand, that there's a good chance there's going to be some cross-pollination there, and there's going to be a lot of information, I think, that's probably useful for both.
Well, the closer we can get and the more knowledge we have, it's better.
Certainly.
Another question for you in looking at this new transition as we're kind of merging these worlds together between 3GPP and Wi-Fi. What would you recommend? I mean, I asked this earlier and you said something about LTE University. If someone's just new into Wi-Fi, is that like a big step for them to move that way? Or do you suggest they finish up, CWE level on the wireless side before they transition over?
I think that maybe CWE level, or at least get at least the CWNA under your belt. I mean, it is a lot of the terms that you learn, just the technology within 802.11, the RF layer, the physical layer, is definitely applicable to LTE. But I don't think that that necessarily LTE University or these types of online educational resources are really something that a new user would be able to jump into unless they've got a lot of background. So I think it might be a large subject to kind of consume for somebody, but provided, you've got that at least, CWNA underneath your belt, would probably be a good point to be able to start looking at that. Now, that's not to say there isn't resources out there that are geared towards, kind of a soup to nuts, from a technologist, somebody who's on the routing switching side, let's say, to get into LTE. And those resources, I'm sure, will if they're not there today, will definitely come to fruition soon, given the surge into the enterprise ecosystem. But I think it's again pretty hard to just jump into that without something there. And I'm not aware of. I don't think LTE University is the best way to do that for a new user.
Well, another question on the same line. A lot of times we meet with a wide variety of constituents, either end customers or some IT guy who's, our boss, whatever. How do you explain in a couple paragraphs the difference between how Wi-Fi works and how LTE works? I mean, they're substantially different.
Certainly.
What's your little story you tell?
I try to focus on the strengths. I don't want to get into the argument that some folks, I'm sure, do, where they look at it as a competing technology. LTE's strength is going to be in delivery of mission critical applications where QoS is, especially important, and complementary to that, delivery of cellular services indoors or outdoors. Obviously, it's used in the carrier network, but in the context of, say, CBRS in the enterprise. While 802.11 can provide lots of throughput, is relatively simple to deploy from a there is no major core pieces, there is no regulatory pieces. There's spectrum readily available that's unlicensed. So I think that the easiest way I would approach that question is just to tell somebody, you're looking at a situation where right now you have X thousands of users in your enterprise that have cell phones, and you're looking at perhaps paying Verizon or AT&T or TELUS or whomever to come in and provide services to those, at your cost. Perhaps looking at a neutral host ecosystem, such as what could be provided over a CBRS LTE network, as a means to be able to deliver exactly the same thing, except you'll control the technology and decide what applications in your enterprise need that level of mission critical capability and to be brought in there. It's a complementary strategy. I would not be surprised if in the future that even a CBRS ecosystem is complemented through what they call LTE Wi-Fi aggregation, where you can add additional capacity using 802.11. The fact that those are going to be living in an ecosystem in the environment of the enterprise where 802.11 is very strong today is only a natural kind of process. I think I don't see folks the nightmare scenario where a network admin is looking at at LTEU being something that's going to take up all of their channel capacity. That's a decision they can make today, and it's a decision they can make tomorrow. There's no reason to get rid of the 802.11 infrastructure whatsoever. In fact, it would be foolish to do so. They're definitely complementary things. It's just as the world of automation and automated vehicles or even automated manufacturing come into focus, we need the ability to be able to deliver real-time traffic in an assured manner that today 802.11 can't do as well, simply because it's just not built for it at the moment.
Well, the 802.11 is not a good steward of spectrum.
Correct.
With only one device can transmit at a time on a frequency, versus there's lots of other ways to use that spectrum more efficiently. On the other hand, it's free and it's everywhere. So
exactly, ubiquity is important. It really is, and that's something that, again, I can't stress it enough. Nobody should be feeling like LTE in the enterprise is a competitor. It's an opportunity.
Well, good. Now the last question is going to be a little politically sensitive, so you may or may not want to answer it. I've seen Ruckus has been pushing CBRS fairly strongly. Is this something that you can get on a wide variety of platforms from a hardware standpoint?
As far as like an integrated Wi-Fi and CBRS, is that what you're referring to?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
To be honest, I'm not necessarily sure that the major vendors have taken that approach. I know Ruckus has. For their business, it makes perfect sense because the cable companies, now that they're part of Aris, is a major customer of theirs who are very much interested in playing in that space. The other vendors out there, I think they're kind of taking more of a wait and see approach, that they're not jumping into it right away. Does that yield the floor to one vendor or another? I'm not really so sure, because I think their enterprise customers are probably taking the same approach as well.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it has to be integrated, and that's kind of what Ruckus is saying. It should be integrated, and yet it doesn't have to be.
Yeah, it doesn't need to be. Any more than it depends on what you want to do with it. But if you even the most integrated example that I gave earlier of LTE and Wi-Fi aggregation, or LWA, it does not require that it be made by the same vendor on the network side. There's an interface that is, again, a standardized published interface that can be added. Vendor choose to add that to their WLAN offering, and then that interface can support an LTE network with aggregation. So there is absolutely no need, in my view, to have one piece of hardware to service both needs. In fact, you may find that the RF design piece is going to prefer a separate LTE from Wi-Fi, because you're not going to necessarily need as much LTE as you will Wi-Fi because of the differences in the physical air and the air interface. But you're going to see, you don't need to build it as densely. I think from a sales perspective, if I was Ruckus, I would think that's a great compliment, and it's providing a great value to them and their shareholders. But in my view, it's not necessarily an absolutely necessary strategy.
Well, a lot of us coming from the wireless LAN side use tools like Ekahau, Magnet, or Tamosoft from our design standpoint. What kind of tools are available for CBRS?
Well, the same tools that you would use, for DAS design or even for Wi-Fi design. If you look at, I don't know if necessarily what the roadmaps for Magnet or Ekahau are going to look like, but I would expect those to be in there. But when we look at some of the tools for validation and design, there's tools called RAN Plan. IB-Wave is basically kind of the gold standard for indoor design, and that very much today can support CBRS band, because those bands are used elsewhere in the world, in our LTE standards that are TDD LTE based, just like it will be with CBRS in the US. So you can make that integrated design decision there. Within the same tool sets. But it would be wise, I think, for the 802.11 vendors the 802.11 tool developers like the Ekahau's and the Air Magnets of the world to perhaps open up their approach to add CBRS over and LTE together as something that can basically be designed on the same product.
From a surveying standpoint, the validation survey, are there, other than standalone handsets that will be coming with CBRS, are there USB-based CBRS that we could, integrate those into these tools?
There are, and in fact, there's a couple of devices that are available as USB modems, even as mini PCI Express. For instance, the Sierra Wireless EM7565 supports this band. Actually supports 4 carrier aggregation misbands, like an 80 megahertz channel. That device is, I believe, available for either sampling or purchase today. So the USB side, I don't remember off the top of my head which devices those are, but they're definitely out there, and we'll continue to. The idea of analysis is what we call walk testing in the cellular industry, or drive testing is kind of where that came from. And those types of tools are considerably more expensive, where you're looking at $30,000 to $50,000 to have the right rig to go out and test these sorts of things, because there's very, very heavy integration into the handset side. And somebody had to pay, say, Samsung to do that. And Samsung had to, charge us a considerable amount of money to open up their firmware to be able to be integrated with somebody else's third-party tool. But, the type of surveying that we do in 802.11 is very much built around the chipset of the device that you're using. And it's not necessarily, a calibrated device. In the LTE world, it's a little bit different. But I could see some, a tool that like a USB type device providing adequate information, like what they call RSRP, RSRQ, SINAR, et cetera. SINAR is SNR. RSRQ doesn't really have a comparable metric in 802.11, but RSRP is kind of like RSSI with only fair focusing on what they call the reference signal, which is an important part of a handover and reselection within LTE. But those types of metrics are available on any category UE that's out there, right up to your first generation, release 8 handset. So that information in a piece of software running on a Windows or Mac machine that can then generate a heat map is very much within reach today. Has anybody taken that approach yet? I haven't seen it yet. But again, I think we're kind of a little early for that piece of it, but it'll be happening soon enough.
Well, we'll forward your advice onto those companies. I agree. I think it's something that needs to transition and help us all move into that. Well, thanks for your time today, Jeremy. If someone wanted to track you down, how would they find you on blog, Twitter, LinkedIn, wherever?
I'm fairly active on Twitter. It's at Real Jeremy Ward. And then on LinkedIn, it's LinkedIn and /MVDDS.
We will get those and post them in the show notes. Thanks again for your time. I learned a lot, and hopefully our listeners did as well.
Pleasure talking to you, Keith.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
10 Talks.
This is my Devin Aiken meets Mo sense of humor. So a woman's place is either in the ohm or the resistance. Wherever you are, Devin, love you. Okay, so I literally hit save before I came up. I was ready for Thursday. So thank you for showing up for a presentation I almost didn't show up for. The takeaway from this slide is that, yes, I finally figured out how to send in my paperwork, and I have a number. And 2, I finally got access to the corporate Shutterstock account, so if nothing else, you're going to get some pretty graphics. They're probably taking them away from me soon, so pay attention. So, welcome to Wi-Fi Club, and of course, the first rule of Wi-Fi Club is it may not be well understood. I know that there have been a lot of really good blogs out there on WPA 3, and at least one that completely missed the point, but some of them may have felt a little anemic, and there's a good reason for that. It may not be widely known, but the WFA keeps a pretty tight control over. There's some confidentiality clauses, at least until the protocol becomes standardized, and so there are some strict rules about what can and cannot be said. And since I didn't go to law school, today's goal is I now have 8 minutes to say something that's useful and interesting, but also legal. So, first, talk about the perception, or the reality versus the perception of the reason behind the updates. The world lost its mind last year, and what I believe it was Fox or Guardian said that Wi-Fi has not been hit by an electromagnetic pulse. But a lot of the blogs, at least 50% of the ones that I saw, led with, well, of course, we have WPA 3 on the heels of Wi-Fi being cracked. The reality is that Wi-Fi's ego got bruised a little bit, but it's not broken. The real reality is that this BlackBerry was cutting-edge technology when WPA 2 got announced. And the iPhone, the first iPhone, was 3 years from being released. And so Wi-Fi keeps innovating and changing, and the security that supports it also needs to, and really that's the reality. So this portion of our presentation is the just the facts, ma'am, which is why you saw Scully on the previous slide. So bear with me. So the WPA2 enhancements, and I saw that almost no one talked about those, and there's a reason for it, because it's not that interesting. But it's part of the announcement, and so I just wanted to cover it. So the first part of the enhancement for WPA2 has to do with 11W. So it has the protective management frames, which has been largely adopted by vendors and clients already. But to get the WPA2 certification for the enhancement, it's now going to be mandatory. The second feature, which the WFA wrote as devices are required to validate network authentication server certificates appropriately. Okay, all that stuff that you did to patch for crack, it's now mandatory also, and it will go into the WPA3 as well. And the third one is that it's going to standardize the cryptographic suite. Now, it's still at 128 bits, but it's all standardized. Now, the good news for you, and I'm not going to speak for all vendors, but the good news is that most of them are probably already there. The certification's not out yet, but the chances are that you're probably already there for the enhancements. So for the features, let's talk first about SAE. So simultaneous authentication of equals has to do with protecting you against stupid passwords, right? And at least a couple of blogs have sort of described that this is going to protect you against dictionary attacks. This is not Webster's dictionary. This is a protection against a dictionary attack that was created something like what this graphic says this is a web scraper, and the way these work is that a dictionary attack isn't going to Webster's dictionary, it's going to the Gregor dictionary, because I have scraped all of your social media, and I have come up with the most likely versions of passwords that you would use, and there's a dictionary out there just for you, or one out there just for Keith. Well, and thank you for the segue, sir, because the second bullet references OCHCO 123, and I said it's protecting you from dictionary attacks, but not from the U.S. Secret Service. And this is a nod to Roman Seleznev, who is perhaps the world's best hacker in terms of credit card theft in the world. Not only is he the best at stealing credit cards, but he actually invented his own business model and later set up a marketplace on the dark web so that he was selling other people's stolen credit cards at a commission. So this guy is really smart, right? Only when they caught on to him, which was fairly early on, he had to keep changing identities. He kept using the same password for multiple accounts, OCHCO 123. So when the U.S. Secret Service caught up to him on vacation, and we all take a laptop with us on vacation, we all take an encrypted laptop with us on vacation, all they had to do was put in OCHCO 123, and there were 127 million stolen credit cards, because you take that with you when you go to the Maldives, right? So it was pretty much over with for him. So no, SAE is not going to protect you against stupid, but it will protect you against things like what an actual dictionary attack is. So that's there, and that's all to the better, and it's a long time coming, and that's a great thing. OWE, opportunistic wireless encryption. And if you want to have a good time, go out. There's RFC 8110 that was written more than a few years ago, and it's probably going to be the basis for this. This is going to give us some protections for open SSIDs. So as much as I got tired of hearing myself say, well, maybe a good thing can come out of crack, maybe we'll start paying attention to the honest-to-God real problems, like man-in-the-middle attacks. And spear phishing. I haven't seen that borne out, but I do still have hope. So the opportunistic, or OWE, is going to give us the ability to, instead of having an open SSID, having an SSID that a negotiation will happen between the access point and the client, and there'll be a Diffie-Hellman exchange, and so you'll actually have a key that's not exchanged by any humans, and therefore potentially much more secure. And then the last one is DPP. The idea behind this is to protect anything that's sort of a headless device, anything that's an IoT device that in the past we've had to rely on using a smartphone or the Passpoint. And so the methodology behind this, I can't really talk legally more about that, but I'm looking forward to it, coming back and saying some more about that. The idea is that this is going to be, now I forgot what my last point on that one is. IoT, MDU and hospitality. I think there's real potential for this, not just the high-end integrated home market. So what's it all mean? Are you all going to have to do a forklift upgrade for any of this? Everything I've talked about up until now, probably not. I can't speak for all vendors, but there are, and the caveat is that we're talking about the latest access points. If you've got something that's still supported but end of sale, it's probably not going to have the onboard resources to deal with what is going to almost definitely be just a firmware upgrade. So all of those things are good news. Of course, there's a caveat. The 192-bit encryption, I'm going to explain the cute graphic in a second if I have 60 more seconds. This is the slide where I was going to talk about classical encryption versus the quantum encryption that's coming up that my husband told me was a bridge way too far. So if I had more than 10 minutes, I'd tell you more about classic encryption, Alice and Bob. But we're going to talk instead about Suite B. I told you I had Shutterstock. I didn't say they had anything that said for Suite B, but so it's my Suite B. So all of my Aerohive people, that's my love for you. I know what you're asking. Does this have anything to do with elliptical curve cryptography? No. Elliptical curve cryptography in the era of a quantum computer will be crackable within a few minutes. Everything that we're doing up in classical encryption, which is the largest prime number times the second largest prime number, take that product and then factor it, they'll be able to do that in seconds like it's going through butter. But even elliptical curve cryptography will be able to be broken. So if I get to come back, I'll explain to you how you get ice cream with elliptic curve, with post-quantum cryptography key distribution. But until then, just remember that itdrc.org is out there and supporting from NorCal to Virgin Islands. This guy up there is an Aruba SE. He spent a weekend deploying ruckus access points that I was supporting from the comfort of my own living room. Because when you're talking to people in FEMA trailers who've lost literally everything, it just doesn't matter whose vendor's equipment you have and what vendor you work for. ITDRC, and thank you to, somebody volunteered to give me your old gear yesterday. So thank you for you guys.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Wireless LAN Professionals Podcast, the podcast for wireless LAN professionals by wireless LAN professionals. Be sure to follow us on Twitter @WirelessLANPros for all the latest news and updates, and also connect directly with Keith on Twitter @KeithRParsons. Head over to www.wlanpros.com for this episode's show notes, as well as the latest in all things Wi-Fi.